listen to Juan Notaro, President of FONPLATA Development Bank.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate. In the banks, the financial institutions that we are, we tend to focus on loans granted, the credit portfolio, disbursements, yields, and the movements of the market. The business of finance, after all, is all about lending money and recovering it with interest. And the poor service we would do to our countries if we did not call for the financial health and solidity of our institutions. The proposed reflections for this contribution, therefore, are most opportune. What is the role of development banks and the financing of social infrastructure and sustainable projects? And the second, even more, can development banks plant the seed for solidarity between people? These are questions that help make us pause to reflect why we do what we do. In my first years working at the Inter-American Development Bank around 2000, Enrique Iglesias repeatedly brought a message to a board that marked me personally for the rest of my professional path in different multilateral institutions. He always said, never forget that in the IDB we are more than a bank. The more than a bank are the people. In order to have this always in mind, in FONPLATA, a development bank from Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay, we have incorporated this into our slogan, taking development closer to people. It is a philosophy that guides our work, but that, at the same time, obliges us to ask ourselves an even more difficult question. How? How can we take development closer to people? What is our role? What should we do? What is the best way to do it? In order to start reaching an answer, I would like to remember the words of Pope Emeritus Benedicto XVI when he said that the economy and finances don't exist for themselves alone. They are simply an instrument or a means. Their only purpose is the human person and its total realization and dignity. That is the only capital that is correct to safeguard. The human person and its total realization and dignity, the most valuable capital of all. It is a theme that is ever more present in the economic and financial global forums. In the recent forum in Davos, the concern of how to make the economy and financial instruments for a fairer world was present in many of the discussions. No longer does this mean simply philanthropy, no socially responsible programs to display in annual reports, but rather a growing conscience amongst the world's corporations of the necessity to cooperate with other social agents in order to become more competitive. Not for profit alone, but in the sense that their concern and their effective action for the environment, for inclusion, and for social rights are the clues for their future survival in a society that has already started operating under different codes. The challenges are enormous. In the region where I work, Latin America, all middle-income countries, the inequality remains alarming, as Michael was mentioning before. Of the 50 countries with the highest social mobility in the world, only 3 are Latin American, and the best place is Uruguay, just in the 35th place. Poverty remains persistent and hereditary. The economic and social achievements obtained during the commodities boom have deteriorated and are even more difficult to sustain, with the social, political, and economic instability in many of our countries underlines a complex panorama that in some cases has forced massive migratory movements that have generated additional problems in the region. Add to this the biggest global threat of our time, climate change and its consequences. Some days ago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, warned that we must be prepared for the displacement of millions of people due to the ever more frequent and intense climatic events. I list these problems not intending to generate a alarm of despair, but rather to outline a panorama that will allow answers to the question posed at the beginning. Can we be more effective and achieve more in our mission for development by recuperating and promoting a culture with greater solidarity? I believe that we definitely can. Firstly, Development banks, as members of multilateral systems, have a privileged position that must be used in their interaction with governments, civil society, and the business world in the supply of resources and viable alternatives in order to address the inequalities within and between regions. Secondly, the development of alliances and the joint coordination of efforts, knowledge, and financial resources between our institutions must be an additional priority in order to reach a capacity and agility of response that is consistent with the magnitude and increasingly critical deadlines of the challenges we face. The changes occur ever faster. Also, the frequency and devastating impacts of financial, migratory, climatic, or pandemic crises, such as the present coronavirus, are worst on those that are the most vulnerable, independent of where they live. Thirdly, for our banks, more austere and less bureaucratic, being efficient, more austere and less bureaucratic is also a sign of solidarity. In particular, solidarity with our countries that are largely the ones who provide our capital, especially in times when public funds do not abound. It would be a very positive sign if partnerships were strengthened with the corporate sector for greater fundraising. Fourthly, we must never forget that the final recipients of our efforts are the people, and in particular those that for the different reasons are held back or who face restrictions that prevent them from progressing, having better opportunities, and achieving better quality of life. In the words of Pope Francis, it is time to lift the poor up out of their despair. That is to say, give them knowledge, the resources, and the tools to move forward. Now, therefore, is it time to make a significant effort to overcome another of the big imbalances of the developing world, the technology gap. For example, there already exists a Brazilian bank that is 100% digital. With a cell phone presence of more than a phone per inhabitant, the development of digital financial services is a big step in favor of financial inclusion in a country where close to 50 million people don't have a bank account. At the development banks, we have an obligation to open our doors and our financing to this type of innovative initiatives that take advantage of technology to encourage inclusion of the poorest among the populations. Lastly, the environmental challenges and climatic changes mean that we need to take into account new paradigms. The approach should be comprehensive. This does not mean simply incorporating new technologies or a more solid structure, but rather changing our way of thinking and acting, our production and consumption habits, and also to be prepared, if at all possible, to face the imminent impacts of population displacements that we are being warned about with an attitude of greater solidarity. These are the tasks, the compromises that development banks must take on along with civil society organizations, political parties, governments, and other international organizations. If we do it, we will be encouraging inclusion, equality, and the overcoming of some historical injustices with which we have been living with for too long. We will be meeting our responsibility to finance infrastructure with a social focus, sustainable projects, but also, and in reply to the second question that we posed at the beginning, we will be sowing the seed of solidarity between peoples. Thank you.